Now, although the timeless bliss, the reasonless joy, the ultimate healing is outside of language and thus outside of many of the structures and paradigms of the culture. And in that sense, it cannot be reached within the framework of language. What we can do is, within language and within culture, we can bring the probability higher of going through that door. So down here, we have the barrier. And in this domain, we have language and culture. We have human consciousness. And in this domain, on the other side, we have the unity experience, the transcendent experience, that includes everything but is beyond human consciousness. It's bigger than human consciousness. And there's a doorway. And this doorway is the entrance to the transcendent regions of the brain. Now, we understand that when people experience near-death experience, 5-MeO, DMT experience, DMT experience, ecstatic, transcendent, timeless senses of joy, we understand that inside the brain, there's an environment that is conducive to the release of endogenous DMT and other chemicals in the brain that allow us to be conscious in a certain way that we cannot remember, because what we remember is in language. So when we reassemble the past, we use our words and break time down into pieces and break space down into pieces. And then we put the pieces back the way we cut them at that time, and we remember the way that we cut them. We reassemble something in the same pattern. And this is a memory. Now, the memory of a transcendent experience is just the remembrance, the awareness that there was something else, that there was something beyond, that there was something that we do not have language for. And there's a sense of joy in the movement towards that transcendence. So while culture cannot take us into ecstasis out of the structure that it resides in the paradigms and language, culture can take us to closer to this doorway, meaning if we, within our various boxes, break culture down into various probability fields, there's an arena of culture that takes us closer to the door, where the doorway and everything else dissolves, where there is a transcendent experience. And it's those directions, it's the pointers to the doorway that we're going to look at here. So there's a number of vectors that bring us a little bit closer to this door. And because intelligence is the pursuit of and the realization, the mastery of sustainably high levels of well-being, the intelligence of a culture can be measured by how reliably it provides a path to sustainable high levels of well-being. And we can overlay this journey with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because down here, and maybe we'll move this over here to be out of the way of the logo. So down here we have survival. So a culture that takes someone from not being likely to survive, for example, infants deposited on desert islands are going to die. So a culture that doesn't do that, but instead institutionalizes the care of children, make sure that every child has adequate food, adequate clothing, adequate nourishment, is a culture moving towards, that's facilitating the first of our human needs, which is to survive. In cultures that have homelessness, for example, we haven't fully reached that point. A homeless person will lose 26 years of their life statistically if they're chronically on the street. And so the more homeless people, the less intelligent the culture. Now, as you move to the next level, which is security of survival, this is the consistency and certainty that a human ego can look out and say, yeah, everyone around me is being cared for, is surviving with stability. So cultures that utilize high levels of traumatic violence and punishment in media and in their news and actual life cycle, you have a reduction. So when you have highly traumatic police arrests, where they go out of their way to break down people's doors who would have gladly opened the door, or point guns at children, as was the case in Florida when one of the scientists there was publishing information on COVID, and the response, because the governor, was in disagreement with her politics and science, sent an armed SWAT team to steal her laptop. But, pointing guns at children, etc., you have a lower level of intelligence, because you have to extrapolate and say, well, a country, a cult that would aim a killing weapon at an infant over a dispute about information is not a very secure culture. When freedom of speech is not protected but is violently attacked, you have a reduction in the security of the culture. When an identity, an ego, a cultured persona can look out and see that every member of their cult or culture is being treated with as much love and respect as is possible, you have a strong security in the survival. And if you move up a little bit higher, you come to love and belonging. Now, love and belonging, first of all, is that the isolated individual is included in the circle versus excluded from the circle. And so belonging means to be included. Now, what does it mean to be included in the cult identity? It means that all that you are, all that you say, that you think, that you feel, that you understand, that you do, is, first of all, understood, is empathized with, that who you are, which is a fractal version, because this cult is broken down into different slices and demographics, but so is the ego, so is the individual. So the individual is, there's the one that hates, there's the one that is excited, there's the one that is disappointed, there's the one that's sad, there's the one that's grieving. And all of these parts are parts of the individual because the individual is an internalization of the cult. And if you move over here to the cult, there are people who are in total grief, who have just lost someone. There are people in total hate who feel helpless and hurt and alone. And you have people who are totally sadistic and intending to cause as much hurt as possible. And you have people who are focused on hedonic pleasure in every sense of the word, and you have people who are lying and people who are telling the truth. And so a cult, at some level, contains the entire probability field of the human experience. Now, when you have a high level of love and belonging, there is ownership within the cult of each faction generated by the cult. For example, the person who's in a sadistic place this is not a random thing. It's not like the baby was born and the baby set out to hurt as many people as possible. No, the baby was born. The baby may have been dropped. The baby may have been separated by their mother in a traumatic hospitalization. For example, Ted Kaczynski, the person known as the Unabomber, was traumatically separated in early childhood from his parents, who were not allowed to see him during a traumatic hospital stay. And by the time he came out of the hospital, he had lost his ability to access his empathic brain. His empathic brain was so terrified by the experience and so terrified by the loneliness of the experience, that when this was combined with a prolonged psychological torture by the CIA without permission in the university that he attended, with a focus on humiliating him consistently, that by the time he had gone through the protocol of traumatic separation from his parents, and then been tormented by his own government with the use of taxpayer money, there was a part in Ted that felt tremendously hurt, tremendously hostile, tremendously angry, and wanted to attack that which had robbed him of his humanity, which he focused on technology, because it was in the hospital that he lost his ability to empathize and bond with his family. He lost his humanity in the institutional cult of psychopathic medicine, meaning where the human being is not honored, where they're treated as a machine. And so the terror that elicits in a young child that needs to bond with their parents is not honored. And when you dishonor a part in someone, the survival coping strategy of the dishonored part. So, if I'm in a cult that shames and attacks this part of me, this region of my psyche, systematically, with no reprieve and no acknowledgement of the wound, then this part of me, as a survival mechanism, will seek to attack the part of the cult that does that. And if it's a blinding wound, meaning if the pain is so intense that that's the only part that you can see, then this wound can grow to where a part of the individual wants to destroy the entirety of the cult that induced that wound. And so you have a pairing between a sociopathic part in an individual that is induced by a sociopathic part of the cult in which they are born. And for evolution to take place, the sociopathic arena in the cult has got to be healed, educated, transformed to stop harming a certain region of the individual psyche. Otherwise, the individual region of the psyche that is harmed will work to undermine, to sabotage, to challenge, to attack that part of the cult which caused it harm. This is just how evolution works. If you will kick your dog repeatedly, your dog will go into fight, flight, and freeze. If your dog cannot escape the kicking, if it cannot run, and if you keep kicking it when it rolls over, it will eventually become highly aggressive and seek to bite and attack anyone, believing that, in the instinctual coding of life, this is the best path of survival, to kill and attack that which is causing sadistic, chronic harm. And so in an intelligent cult, you do not systematically harm your people. You don't psychologically torment a traumatized child who has been dissociated from their empathy under the auspices of care by an ill-informed hospital. And so if you cannot own the Ted Kaczynski produced by the sociopathic elements in your cult, there's a lower level of love and belonging. If you can understand the pattern and approach it from both sides, if you can own basically within the cult the sadistic elements of the cult, the cruel elements of the cult, and then own the sadistic elements of the individual and the cruel elements that are induced out of the sociopathic elements of the cult, and which then become the sociopathic elements of the cult. If we can see it as a circle, you have a higher level of love and belonging. Because in the sociopathic and lower levels of love and belonging, the cult induces trauma, pain, etc. in its children, in its teenagers, in its employees that turn hostile. But then the cult disowns and shames and obfuscates the pattern, but blames the individual for the feelings they have and the mathematical readouts, because the heart is a scientific instrument. And so when you induce hate in the heart, then that heart hates. To induce hate in a heart, for example, you have to create pain that is unbearable. And then you have to create, which leads to fear of pain, which is unbearable, which leads to seeking help and relief. You then have to deny that heart help and relief. When you could offer it, you have to withhold and deny it. And then finally, you have to induce helplessness in that heart. So if you do this to a child, for example, where they cannot provide for themselves, so they feel completely helpless, that will produce hate as a state within that individual. Now, if the hate is then condemned, shamed, and dissociated from in order to protect the reputation of the parent, then you induce You have more cruelty directed at an already shamed and in pain heart. And so now you create an animosity. Now you create a struggle for power because the power that is there is not competent. And so the child, the adolescent, the citizen wants to reject the sociopathic and incompetent level of power that is there. But the sociopathic, narcissistic element of the power that is there does not want to relinquish the power, and so fights, further compounding and escalating the pain, because by fighting to protect corruption of power, corruption of ideals, rather than surrendering, you have a dynamic where the individual, it becomes more and more convinced of the corruption of the power structure. And so you have an escalation of violation, where you have the cult is violating the individual, and the individual is dishonoring and violating the cult. And so this energy grows until there's an evolutionary breakthrough. Now, in a healthy dynamic, the individual wrests the authority and power away from the dysfunctional elements of the cult and creates a higher level of inclusion. In a dysfunctional and unconscious system, the abused becomes the new abuser. The abused seeks power to not be abused, but once they have the power, they have internalized the protocol of the abuser. And so they then do what the abuser did to others that were less powerful, or seek revenge on the abuser. And so this is the cycle of intergenerational abuse. So all of these are in the domain of measuring the competency of love and belonging. But it comes down to, is the whole self included or excluded in the cult? The more competent a cult is, the more of the self can be owned and included inside the cult. The more incompetent the cult is, the more waste is generated. Because waste is energy that a cult, that a person doesn't know what to do with. The entire fabric of reality is energy in a pattern. And when human beings create energy in a pattern that they do not know what to do with, they can do one of two things. They can say, wow, we've created this and we don't know what to do with it. Or they can say that is garbage. They can relabel the energy as waste, creating a fictitious remainder, creating an arena of energy that they don't know what to do with. And so that energy becomes a tax on the system. And all taxes on a system that reduce the sustainable amount of well-being correlate to a lower level of intelligence. So we have a growing portion of minorities, of minority thought, etc., that must then be fought against and defended against. The cult has to then spend more and more energy on walls and defense. This is us, this is not us. This is us, this is not us. So this is the calcification of the cult and the calcification of the ego, which is a microcosm of the cult. So now the isolated parts of the psyche, in Jung's experience, deteriorate and become hostile. So the unloved, dissociated and disowned parts of the psyche and of the cult deteriorate and become hostile towards the cult and towards themselves. And in that form, they become less and less usable. And so here we have the continuum of love and belonging. So this is a huge continuum, because the continuum of love and belonging is how welcoming, how loving is the cult to an individual, and how welcoming and how loving, how supportive is the cult to all of the individual. There you have the continuum of love and belonging, which is the arenas of the self that are accepted, and the skill with which they are accepted, and the competency or the intensity. So you can have intense love and belonging, deep empathy, or you can have you're fine. We'll let you, fine, you can be a part of us. Kind of an ambivalence. So you have the ambivalence down here. You have we are honored to have you a part of us up here. You have the skill down here, where I don't really know how to see you and understand you and accept you, to I deeply understand and know how to accept you up here. And then we have the regions, where this one part of you, I like that. But this other part of you, I hate that. I don't want that. Get that out of here. To where all of who you are is accepted inside the framework. So these are the three continuums of love and belonging, and they are vast. In our cult, we have a very low level of love and belonging, and a very high level of fear. Fear of what? Fear of loneliness, fear of exclusion, fear of judgment, fear of being cast outside of the circle, considered an unsafe, unwanted, destructive person. And so you have a tremendous amount of secrecy. In a sociopathic shame cult, you will typically have at least half of the person feels unloved and unaccepted, and in Jung's terms, regresses, becomes less functional. And in a highly functional cult, the cult owns every member as part of itself. And when someone harms another in the cult looks inside, looks at, if you take Toyota's response to car mistakes, if there's a stoppage on the Toyota assembly line, they go 5 levels deep. And what that means is they ask, why is there a stoppage? And then they ask, why did that happen? And then they ask, well, why did that happen? Like if the stoppage occurred because they were out of screws, then they say, well, why were they out of screws? And they say, well, they didn't have enough sleep, and they forgot to order the screws. Why did that happen? Well, they're overworked. And why has that happened? Well, their boss has been giving them, 20 hours of homework to do, and they can't get it done. And why did that happen? Well, the boss is not in tune with the person and the system. And so why did that happen? Well, there was some nepotism there. The boss was hired as a friend, but not as the most competent boss. And so then if you can stop that pattern, then all of these things disappear. Because while beliefs can all be proven true, you just pick the beliefs that you want. The beliefs can all be proven true. The belief that people want to grow, that people want to be happy, that human nature is basically evolutionary and good, is a very important belief, because it can be proved true if you act accordingly and generate a reality where lots of people feel excited and love working there. And so we have we're struggling to have more of our cult members secure in their survival. And then we're really struggling when it comes to loving and accepting ourselves, and loving and accepting those around us, and creating a high probability field of love and acceptance for all of who we are. And we're also struggling around the science of correlation. We really are profoundly ignorant as we look at the cult norms that generate massive amounts of suffering. For the most part, we are more afraid of shifting those cult norms and going into the unknown than we are of embracing the feedback loop of data to evolve our cult. So the next thing that comes is self-esteem. This is when an individual is empowered to have ideals, which always move towards beauty, truth, and goodness after some experimentation. Beauty, truth, and goodness feel better than ugliness, lies, and unnecessary suffering. I mean, this is a no-brainer. And so the innate drive of humanity, which is running parallel, the drive which is to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse, correlates with this progression of human needs. And so you move up the ladder. So a cult that is mature will support the creative exploration of its adolescents to discover what they find, what their ideals are, and then will support and empower them to move towards those ideals of beauty, truth, and goodness. Letting each person find out what they honor and value in themselves. And so you have a natural convergence there. But self-esteem is when you live your principles that help you move towards a life of more beauty, truth, and goodness, which then leads to the next human need, which is to discover what we're good at. What are we uniquely gifted with? You see, and we're in the ecology of life, and life is a cycle. And a cycle is a pendulum swing. That's one part of the way, it's ultimately a circle, but within the paradigm of polarity, we see the pendulum swing between the poles. And what happens is, because the point of grace is in the center, and the point of grace, the place of least energy expenditure and thus highest intelligence, is in the center. Let me give a moment. See, the thought of all this joy and excitement was interrupted with a rejection, meaning I allowed someone to reject me in my mind, and it hurt, and then I couldn't think, right? So that's the devolution from high levels of competence to low levels of competence, which is the devolution from high levels of well-being to low levels of well-being. Because you have the intelligence continuum, you have the continuum of well-being, you have the continuum of human needs, and they're all going in the same direction. So human needs are one of these vectors that head towards the gateway. And we all need to be good at something. And the gift that we're given is the genetic personality predisposition to medicate the imbalance of the status quo. So at any given point, the cult is at a point on these polar continuums, and the medicine is going back to the center. And so if a cult is way over here in materialism, then going back to center is to meditate more. And so you may be gifted in your cult with the profound ability to meditate. But if your cult is self-referential, which all traumatized cults are, they will reject the medicine because a a cult that defines itself by itself rather than as a movement towards a state of grace will say, well, we're the materialist cult. You don't belong here. But I'm your medicine. No, you're not. You're a deviation from our cult. We're becoming more and more materialistic because we're the materialist cult. And we're the materialist cult because that's who we are. And we know we're that way because we've been going that way for a while. My parents were materialistic, their parents were materialistic, and that's why we're materialistic. Now, self-referential loops always lead to extremes, and extremes always lead to unnecessary suffering. And so you need to head back towards your center. And the medicine is gifted in the next generation, which will provide a psychological and genetic pull back to center, which then the cult has the opportunity to heed or to start fighting with its own people and its own self and to continue the war of dogma, which is the war of extremes. Now, if a cult develops its gifts and those gifts are then integrated into the culture abundantly, tremendous value is released in the alchemical interaction of gifts and culture. Abundance and value is released. And this is when you get to the highest state, which is transcendence. Because in the warmth of basking in the abundance of competency and having one's gifts honored, that warmth is the chemical bath in which the endogenous DMT is released, in which trust in the world is released and produced in the body along with its chemicals. See, trust is a chemical, but it's only produced in cults that are trustworthy. Trustworthy to facilitate an individual moving from survival to transcendence. That is a trustworthy cult that will produce trust. Trust is then safety is necessary. Well, if a cult doesn't produce security for its people, there is no safety. So all of these chemicals and these feelings create a bath in which the endogenous sense of transcendence is released. And it's an intelligent hierarchy. It's a pyramid. Now, so that's one of the vectors that's heading towards here. Now, another vector is art and creativity. Because art and creativity, if you look at haiku, if you look at a poem, you're going to the edge of the doorway. The doorway is the point at which words no longer are tethered as the primary map of reality. And poetry is playing around with those words. Puns, humor. So you have humor. So a humorous cult, a poetic and artistic cult, a cult that helps people move through their hierarchy of needs efficiently, a cult that dances, that creates altered states. So you can create altered states with psychedelics. You can create altered states with extreme endurance, running, sleep deprivation. You can create altered states by dancing for 3 days and 3 nights. You can create altered states with music, with sensory stimulation. So again, a cult that induces altered state moves us to that domain. Now, in order to transcend the body, one needs, ideally, a healthy body. So a cult that balances heart, mind, and body moves us towards the state because we've got a brain, we've got a heart, we've got a mind that is capable of embracing beauty, goodness, and truth. If you have a severely malnourished body in a shame-based cult that attacks the body, well, now you've got an incapacity. When you shame and attack a body, it doesn't grow and become more competent. It becomes more disabled to do what? To do anything, but certainly to progress through needs and move towards that transcendent moment. And then you have trauma. See, trauma takes you down to the reptilian brain. Within the brain paradigm, you have the reptilian brain, the rational brain, the empathic brain, and the transcendent brain. And the oldest brain is the reptilian, the sociopathic brain. When you traumatize an individual, you chemically feed the fight, flight, freeze reptilian brain in their body. As you move into the rational reptile, you have the highly competent sociopath, which is more dangerous than the infant in trauma, because the rational sociopath can manipulate and orchestrate great harm to others and themselves because they understand patterns. So you know, if you traumatize someone but give them an education, you will create a rational sociopath. And a rational sociopath has a strong block against empathy. And the reason for that is that when they were empathic in infancy and childhood, the empathy was abused, violated. And you see, empathy is over here. And empathy says that we are one. We are part of one circle. That's empathy. Now, an intelligent person that honors empathy cannot hurt another person. Why? Because to do so is to hurt oneself, to hurt one's culture. It doesn't make sense. So in order to hurt someone, you have to dissociate from your own empathic brain, which isn't fun. The empathic brain is delightful. It's warm, it's caring, it's compassionate. The empathic brain is delightful. So you have to give up that delight, which increases your pain, which then means you don't want to feel that pain. So then you have to retreat more into the reptilian brain. So reptiles are capable of harming empaths and reptiles. The reptiles don't feel it as much, though. So when the infant, is subjected to chronic abuse by a bigger energy, the infant regresses, has to shut down their empathic field because it hurts too much. But they also have to grapple with the reality that the people around them are not in an empathic state. They're in a reptilian dominant state. And the best way to deal with a reptile is not to expose yourself to a reptile. The best way to deal with a reptile is to protect yourself. And so reptilian energy is viral. The more a reptile attacks someone vulnerable, the more the person who is vulnerable will dissociate from their empathy and enter a reptilian state. And they will enter a reptilian state to survive in a sociopathic environment. Well, now you have a community, a cult, that is largely fear-based, largely reptilian, that is capable of expedient gratification at the expense of self and others. And so, that becomes then an intergenerational loop where the parents abuse the children, and the children abuse themselves and each other, and become parents who abuse their children, and try to find a little bit of love, which is impossible within the domain of the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain cannot love. The reptilian brain is also the oldest brain, and so it's very wired into the body. So if you're in getting traumatic messages, your reptilian brain is waiting to bloom to help you survive a reptilian environment. Now, you cannot go to transcendence through the sociopathic path, you have to go through the empathic path. So you effectively block, when you have trauma in a traumatically illiterate cult, where the trauma doesn't get healed, you basically trap the entire population down in this reptilian rational arena. And these bits up here are not developed. There's no sense of transcendence or unity or ecology or empathy or love. You're down in the horror of being conscious of being a crocodile or being a snake. You're cold-blooded, and it's horrifically painful. Now, in order to numb the pain as a sociopath, you then move towards addiction. You move towards distraction. You move towards giving your pain to other people. And this is largely the cult that we are in today. With there's a mental overlay of should and morality of trying to be a good person while feeling deeply hurt and afraid and in the reptilian brain. And then there becomes a lot of viciousness around that. I'm a better person than that person, or that person isn't a good person. And all that judgment is freezing. It's an ice on the wound of a pain that is not being addressed by the cult. And these are the isolated parts of the individual that are outside the circle. And so this is these are the paths: reducing trauma, which means becoming trauma literate, creating greater safety and familiarity, greater empathy, greater bonding, particularly when you have the fear of the unknown. The more you can bring a community together to see and be seen together, the more safety you create. And so when you then live in cities where nobody knows each other and write online where nobody understands each other, you're reenacting and creating the experience of judgment, misunderstanding, trauma, and isolation with nobody really knowing one. And so one is going down further and further down into isolation, loneliness, and the reptilian brain, and inducing more and more people into that: depression, fear, loneliness, etc. And so these are the paths away. And so the 10x living community is a conscious design within the cult framework of language to hang out up in this arena where every community member is propelled consciously towards meeting their needs to survive, to feel secure, love and belonging, etc. Where there is more art, where there is more balance, more emotional literacy, as well as physical literacy. Because the same is true, in that pendulum swing. If one cult is completely technologically illiterate and focusing on, chanting and meditation, Buddhist sects, for example, a child born into that sect may bring balance back into that by being interested in radio-controlled cars or something like that, to say, wait a minute, don't forget this domain of reality. Don't become extreme in either the dissociation from material things or the obsession with material things. Don't become extreme in the overdevelopment of the Western dissociative scientific mind, or in the mystical experience with no grasp of pattern recognition. Don't become extreme is basically the message of evolution. And so, what evolution tends to do is the next generation or the next political party, don't become extreme as a Democrat, don't become extreme as a Republican. And so in a good evolutionary cycle, there's a tension between these poles, and you move back to center. And so you have humor, you have play, you have creativity, you have abundance. And so in order to create abundance, we also need to design definitions of well-being that are abundant. where you have an abundance of food, an abundance of human connection, and an abundance of love and belonging. These things propel us all towards the doorway. But they can take us to the edge. They can take us to the edge of the doorway. Now, psychedelics can always induce entrance into the doorway. Whether it's 5-MeO-DMT or DMT or LSD or ayahuasca or for some, cannabis. Psychedelics can force an entrance in through the door. However, the problem with forcing an entrance through this threshold is that it's a forced chemical entry. You can hack, the body. But if you do not have a circle around you of warmth and kindness, if you do not have a circle around you of care, if you do not have a cult that embraces the parts that you bring to it, here is my hate, I'm not sure what to do with it. Oh, we gave you that hate in this way, and this way. And we'll medicate that hate by taking away some of the powerlessness. And we'll own it. We'll own it. This is not just your hate, this is our hate. We induced this state together as part of a circle, as part of a cult. And we will heal it together. That's an empathic message. That's a message of love and belonging. It's a very high level relative, to our current cult. So, in summary, no language, no cult, no human ego can enter the divine. You cannot enter heaven through the eye of a needle riding a camel, or, the various metaphors that all the spirituality, all the spiritual mystics, anyone who has tasted that state understands that one must relinquish the ego, which is the attachment to the part that is separate, in order to enter the state that is whole, that is healed. However, highly traumatized egos are afraid of the world because the world hurt them. Highly traumatized egos believe that their ego is the only way to keep alive, and that is often the case in a sociopathic reptilian environment. And so you can take a traumatized ego and administer a substance, but it is not the sustainable journey that creating community, that creating a whole new cult is and can provide. It's not a sustainable journey, because after the substance wears off, you go back into your reptilian brain and are afraid of the world and are afraid of all the things that could have and did hurt you. And you're afraid of the mystical experience for taking down the shield. And so really, it's a cultural evolutionary process to reach this state. And it can be valuable in moments of initiation, in moments of grace that are held in a very sacred community container to initiate and touch the reptilian brain, working with plant medicines. However, it is a form of rape if it's done as a controlled thing, without the embracing of the culture that can support that natural moving up from the reptilian brain to the transcendent brain. And so these are all very important directions to embrace on the continuum of intelligence and the continuum of cultural evolution and evolutionary evolution, so that the journey can be far more beautiful and fluid from the descent from the one into the human ego and cult, and the graceful and safe return to the one in the death of that ego, honoring the birth and the death as two sacred points of a circle of growth, of a circle of consciousness, of a circle of exploration in which part of that whole descends into the illusion of separation for a period of years and ultimately returns, understanding for it to be a healthy and healing lifetime, understanding that while the tunnel vision of the senses blocks off all of the infinite ways we are connected, that in truth, we have never left the womb of the goddess, the womb of the creative expression of all that is, the God, goddess, all that is, the synergy. We've never left it. We've just left our awareness of it by descending into time and space with the tunnels of our senses and the tunnels of our cults. And the journey of illusionary separation can be far more exciting and fun and adventuresome when we have an intuitive sense and can access moments when we know that we are a part of all that is. It is a scientific truth. It is a spiritual truth. It is an individual truth for anyone who examines this terrain. For it to become a cultural truth, we must embrace art. We must embrace humor. We must embrace the commitment to everyone in our circle fulfilling their human needs. We must embrace transcendent experiences of dance and creativity. We must embrace ecology. When we attack our environment attacks us because we are a part of that environment. And all of these things lead to the doorway to the divine, the doorway to unity. All of these things lead to the transcendent regions of the brain that are capable of touching and perceiving that unity and the beauty, truth, and goodness of all that is. Hi, I'm Dane Rose. All knowledge begins with a paradigm, and out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas, with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.